Hi, I'm Sheila Bravo, and today we're going to talk about how to have an effective board meeting. Now, before we get started, I would like you to pause this webinar, not yet, wait till I tell you why, and go and get your board minutes, a couple of them might be helpful, and your bylaws. So pause this and go get them. Do you have them with you? Great, so let's get started. First of all, just wanted to let you know where is the material that we're going to talk about today coming from. As a reminder, Dana is affiliated with the Standards for Excellence Institute. They offer a variety of information around best practices, not only for the boards, but also for operations. And so we're drawing from that material, but then of course, you know me, I like to add a little something else in as well. I also want to thank our sponsors and our alliance partners who have been supporting the work that Dana provides for the past 30 years. Without their help, we wouldn't be able to bring this webinar to you today. So let's get started. We're going to cover a couple of different things. First, why meetings matter in the first place. How do you record them? What are the things that you need to do to prepare? And some things to consider while you're having the meeting so that you can really engage your board members. Step one is to talk about what is a board of directors and why do they matter. I always like to start here because we have to remember that as a nonprofit, you would not exist if you did not have a board of directors. The board of directors are charged by the community to ensure that the nonprofit is doing the work that they're supposed to be doing. So the board of directors serves as a fiduciary, as a steward of the nonprofit's assets, which includes not only property, but also their finances, their people, and their brand reputation. As a fiduciary, boards of directors have a couple of things that they need to do. First, they need to plan. They need to be able to discuss initiatives and from that, evaluate options and ultimately make decisions. If the board does not make a decision, the nonprofit can't move forward. Now I'm going to stop again because just in case you haven't yet gotten your bylaws, I'd like you to pause this video, go get your bylaws so that we can do a couple of quick activities together. Glad that you're back. First of all, what does your bylaws say about the role of the board for your organization? Who is responsible to call the meeting? And how much notice is required? How many meetings is the board required to have annually? How does that compare to what you really do today? Is there an annual meeting required? And if so, what must happen at this annual meeting? What do your bylaws say about how many board members are needed for a vote? And who can actually vote? Those are all important because when it comes down to it, these bylaws are the guide so that the board as a steward can make those important decisions for the nonprofit. Okay, now that you've reviewed your bylaws, let's talk a little bit about the minutes. Minutes are important because they document and record what the decisions the board made on behalf of the organization. And this is important because minutes are kept in perpetuity, so that if ever somebody challenged the nonprofit or challenged the board, the minutes are that legal document that is used. So what are involved in minutes? First and foremost, we want to include who was at the meeting and whether or not there was a quorum. If the bylaws require you to have 12 people at a meeting or 50% of your board or whatever they say, it's important that that is documented. Otherwise, decisions that are made may not really be considered appropriate and you'll have to hold another meeting at a future time to make that call. The minutes record where the meeting was held, what time, and typically we suggest that you document when the meeting started and when it ended. We recommend that the minutes contain the vote on what decisions were made and what future actions are required. This might not seem like a lot. We certainly have seen some nonprofits that have pages and pages of minutes documenting all of the discussion. But when you think about this being the legal record, and if ever, unfortunately, you needed to pull those minutes to prove something in court, you want to make sure that the minutes are tight and reflect the decisions that were made because ultimately that's what would be reviewed. We don't encourage you to document who said what, but perhaps talk about it in language of the board voted, for example. Some nonprofit boards will also hold executive session. And an executive session I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but it would be important to document when the board went into executive session and for what purpose. And that way, again, you have that record for the future. Finally, include when the meeting ended and perhaps even include if there was a decision made for a future meeting. Now, a board meeting can cover many different issues. And if you recall, if you've attended some of our other Dana programs, there are two key activities that boards of directors do. The first is providing resources for the organization, such as setting strategy, representing stakeholders, raising funds, and promoting the organization and its mission. All very important things, and for the board to review the progress that they're making towards that. The second area is monitoring, creating policies and then ensuring the organization is fulfilling those policies. And that includes the financial and legal oversight of the mission, selecting and evaluating the executive director, evaluating the board, and monitoring that programs are fulfilling the outcome goals that you've set and are also meeting your financial and sustainability targets. Meetings should also include activities that sustain the nonprofit board. For example, nomination processes, discussing committee structure, having time to think about board leadership not only now but in the future. At least once a year, talking about what are the board priorities and what does the board need to accomplish for the year. And then we recommend at least every 18 months, no more than every 2 years, to step back and evaluate the board and its performance to ensure that the board is following through on what it needs in order to sustain itself and the organization. So I've set up kind of the bylaws, what do they need to say about the board meeting, how you need to document the meetings, and what are typically the kinds of things that happen in a meeting. So that's a lot of stuff. Here's the reality. Most boards of directors only meet between 8 and 24 hours in an entire year. So all of that stuff that I just talked about, all of those policies to review, conversations around resource provision and monitoring happen in a very short window of time. In fact, when we looked at a recent survey by BoardSource, we found out that factors that influence the quality of board meetings actually revolve around things that you plan in the advance. Board members receiving the material ahead of time and expecting board members to be prepared so when they come in the meeting, they've read the materials that are sent out and those constructive discussions can take place. The meeting experience is also pretty important. First and foremost, is the meeting run well, which puts a little bit of burden on the board chair, since typically that's the function of the board chair. Is there time for discussion? And how much time is actually spent on strategy and policy rather than perhaps talking about an event or something that's happened in the past? Planning for the meeting means, first of all, setting that agenda and starting with what are the outcomes that I want from this meeting? When we're done with our hour and a half or 2 hours, what is it that I hope that we will have accomplished? What decisions does the board need to make? And in order for them to make that decision, what information is required? Think about it. If the board was making a pretty important decision, such as kicking off a capital campaign, it would be important that the board had all of the information in front of them before they could take the vote. Imagine if you walked into a meeting and you were asked to make a commitment to raise $5 million, but you didn't have any information ahead of time that would tell you how you were going to raise the $5 million, what it's for, and what types of activities are going to be expected of you as the board member. So packaging all of that ahead of time and giving it out to your board members will help them be prepared to have those constructive discussions about very important topics. The other thing to think about when we're planning for meetings is to consider what is required to cover in a meeting versus what is desired. First of all, what is required is to, because remember those minutes are in perpetuity, you want to make sure that the board has voted that the minutes of the prior meeting actually reflect what decisions were made. Progress reports. It's important that the board is evaluating whether or not the organization is moving forward towards the goals that it set. So having that information is very helpful. Creating some time for the board to reflect on the good work that they are doing, that the organization is doing, and even team building. One of the things that we have learned through our research is that boards of directors, when they operate like a team and they feel connected to each other, they tend to be more higher performing. Providing education. Particularly if your board meets only 4 times or 6 times a year, they are committed and passionate to your organization, but they probably will not retain everything that they learned when they had their first orientation. So regularly providing some information and education for the board, whether it's about your programs, whether it's about perhaps an issue that's happening out in the community that could cause strategy to change, things that will keep the board up to date and informed so that when the time comes, they can make good decisions. Then how do you want to make your decisions? Is your board a Robert's Rules majority wins type process? Or do you prefer more of a consensus process for decision making? That's going to depend on your board culture and perhaps even what the issue is. But being prepared up front on how you will make the decision can be very helpful. And setting aside time for strategic conversations. At Dana, we call them generative discussions because sometimes we're not ready to make that decision, but what we want to talk about, for example, is what is happening in Delaware? What are some of the policies that are coming forward from the legislature that could impact the nonprofit sector? And in what ways would Dana want to respond? Again, not necessarily getting to an actual decision yet, but having a conversation that can help guide the staff. You may not necessarily need to actually talk about them as much as provide the information for the board to review. For example, in those progress reports, is it necessary for someone to stand up and actually review the progress they're making, or is it perhaps better for that to be a report that the board reads in advance and they don't necessarily talk about? So thinking about how you allocate your time within the meeting gets into how much time is going to be discussed on a topic versus what can be read and voted on. Now that you have your minutes, let's take a couple moments to review them to see how they're recorded and what's happening in your board meetings. First, do they have the documentation of who was there, what time you were met, and when you ended the meetings? Is it clear where decisions were made, who made the motion, and what was the actual vote? How much additional information is provided in these minutes, and are they necessary so that a future board looking back would understand what was discussed and the decisions that were made? What % of the meeting is spent on talking about the past, the present, and the future? Ideally, when we think about boards, we want them to be thinking ahead. So we encourage you to think about, can you get 50% of your meeting focused on future conversation, and the rest of the time is doing those necessary things, such as reviewing progress, as well as having opportunities to reflect on mission. And how much of your time in your minutes do you see the board talking about its own sustainability? Is that something that perhaps happens only once a year, or is in each meeting a little bit of that covered each time? So what is a way in which the board can spend more time on the future and perhaps a little less time on the past? One mechanism is called a consent agenda. A consent agenda includes reports, the prior minutes, committee minutes, and information that might be nice to know but not necessarily important to cover during the board meeting for the board. It can all be packaged together, and at the very beginning of the meeting, the board chair can invite the board to pull something out of consent agenda because they want to talk about it, or the board can vote to accept the consent agenda. That can usually happen in 5 minutes, and then that leaves you plenty of time to talk about decisions and future strategy. So I provided here for you a sample agenda. Agendas are such important documents because it gives the board members insight as to what they're going to be covering, and it helps them prepare for the conversation. We suggest starting with your agenda with the mission and vision of the organization to remind our board members what they're there for and how the decisions will help to move the mission and vision forward. You notice here in this particular agenda, we have a state of the organization and mission example, an opportunity for the executive director to perhaps tell a story, something that engages board members and reminds them of why they're there for that evening or that day. Consent agenda is on this agenda as well. And then in this particular case, the financial reports are not in consent agenda. The treasurer is going to talk about them. So in this agenda, in the first 20 minutes, the board has covered a lot of things about the past, and now they can move forward and for the rest of the meeting, make decisions about the future. So in this agenda, you see that there's a couple of votes that the board needs to make. That includes perhaps creating a new committee, reviewing financials, and looking at officer and board leadership succession. 15 minutes. The reason why they can probably do that in 15 minutes is because all of that information was sent ahead of time for the board to review. Then you have about 15 minutes for board education, and the remaining portion of the board meeting is strategic discussions. In this particular agenda, there's also time for executive session, and you'll notice that there's two parts of executive session. There's time where the CEO is meeting with the board to talk about, in this case, it says a legal issue, but then the CEO is going to step out so that the board can talk and reflect about CEO compensation and evaluation. I also want to point out in this agenda, it also gives the board members an expectation of how much time is going to be covered for each area, so that they can see very quickly that in some cases there's an expectation that these are short decisions or short discussions, and in other times there's much longer time for discussion. We think that's helpful because it also gives the board chair a guide as they go through the meeting to ensure that you're able to cover everything during the meeting time. You've heard me mention advanced materials, so I just thought I would take a couple minutes and talk about that. What to include in a board packet. We suggest having your dashboard, which would include financial and mission metrics, having committee reports, any financial or legal documents that the board needs to read, and certainly policies that the board might be updating or approving. The second would be information about providing resources. For example, what is the status of the capital campaign and what is the expectation of the board members in helping to make that happen? Any background information around strategic direction, or perhaps requests for the board to help out in a certain way. Perhaps you have a big event coming up and you wanted to ask board members if they knew people who'd be interested in serving as sponsors. Who can attend board meetings? Well, your bylaws are going to give you that information, but from time to time, you might want other people to be present because they can inform the board as they make decisions. Elected directors are required, and again, that quorum would give you an indication of how many of them need to be at the meeting. You might also invite different ex officio members. For example, the executive director or CEO might be ex officio, but they may not have a vote, for example. Past president. In some organizations, because of their partnerships, they might have an ex officio member who is on the board of a strategic partner. And of course, any other position that the bylaws indicate. You also certainly can invite people to the board. At Dana, often members of the staff are invited so that they can share some programming information or be part of strategic discussions. But perhaps you're also working on an important initiative and you might bring in your architect. Or when you're completing your audit, we recommend you have the auditor participate at the board meeting so that they can share the insights that they've gleaned. A couple of things about executive session. Executive session is really an important time for the board to not record the discussions or decisions that they're making as it relates to some very sensitive issue. For example, executive compensation, hiring the executive evaluation, legal issues. We do recommend that there is some documentation that takes place within executive session so that, again, there's no misunderstanding in the future about what was discussed and decided upon. Often, you can have minutes taken, and then at the following board meeting in executive session, you would vote on those minutes. Or you record them and keep them in a safe place and have them as reference in the future. The board chair. Now, as I've been talking about creating and planning and leading the board during these meetings, it's typically the board chair's role. For most board of directors, the board chair's primary role is to call the meeting to order, to call for votes, and to move into executive session. Often, though, we do have some greater expectations for our board chair. For example, they can really set the tone and spirit of the meeting. They can help celebrate successes. They can help ensure that everyone's voice is heard. And they can set expectations about board performance and behavior. However you've described and set up the role of the board chair, we recommend the board chair and the executive director work together to think about planning for that meeting, preparing the material, and discussing how they would like the meeting to be set. So how to get started? At your next board meeting, why not ask your board members, what do they think? How do they think the meeting is going? Are there things that can be improved? Suggest this consent agenda idea. How would they feel about perhaps not having each committee member standing up and reporting on their activities, but actually recording them ahead of time so that the board can read them and move on? Ask the board what kind of strategic discussions are important to have. By engaging them in this process, making the changes that you think are necessary to improve the quality of your meetings may not be so hard because you've got them to buy in ahead of time. I want to thank you for taking time to learn about effective board meetings. At Dana, we hope that you will find this, along with many resources that we provide, to help strengthen, enhance, and advance your mission and the nonprofit sector in Delaware. Because it's important for us to continue to improve, I do ask one favor, and that is to please take the very brief survey that follows this webinar to let us know how we're doing. And if you have questions or would like some other samples of things that I talked about today, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can see my email below. Thank you and good luck with your next meeting.